just closed the books on June, and the numbers, well, they tell a story every buyer, every seller, every property owner needs to hear. When you line up what's happening on the streets with the data that's landing, the picture becomes very clear. So let's get into it. G'day folks, it's Matt Hayson here breaking down everything happening in a dynamic Sydney property market. Now every week, as you know, I bring you the headlines, but this week, let's make sense of what's happening on the streets and the data behind it. If I had to sum up June in 2 words, I'm going to call it June Gloom. The headlines, well, they paint a bleak picture. The AFR led with Sydney, Melbourne, price declines deepen in glum housing market. According to Cotality, Sydney property prices have fallen 1.2% through June, and the upper end of the market, well, that's down 1.7% for the month. Over the past 3 months, Sydney values have now fallen 3.2%. Macro Business says Australian house prices are now falling at their fastest pace since 2022. And then there's the auction market. Cotality says Sydney and Melbourne just recorded their weakest auction week in more than 5 years. The Australian, well, that reports that sellers are now questioning recent tax changes as clearance rates continue to crater. Meanwhile, Treasurer Jim Chalmers says it's important not to overreact to a week or even a month of data. And Treasury, well, that still expect property prices to continue growing over the next couple of years, just at a slower pace. But here's the reality. This isn't just 1 week. It isn't even just 1 month. Sydney has now recorded 14 consecutive weeks with the auction clearance rate below 40%. That's 14 weeks. That's no longer a bad weekend. That is embedded. If you look at SQM's auction data, the picture is a lot weaker than the numbers that most of the media are reporting. Last week in Sydney, it recorded an auction clearance rate sitting at 32.49%. There were 871 scheduled auctions, yet only 135 properties sold under the hammer. That's approximately 15% of scheduled auctions actually resulting in an auction on the day. Now, from where I sit, none of this comes as a surprise. The conversations we're having every day have certainly changed. Buyers, well, they are cautious. Sellers, they are becoming more realistic. And campaigns, well, they are also taking longer to sell. Negotiations, well, they are also becoming tougher. Yet, the data is now catching up with what many of us have been experiencing across the market and on the grounds for many months. Now, whenever the property market softens, one of these arguments comes roaring back to life. We paid 17% interest rates in the late 1980s. You young people, well, you don't know how easy you've got it. Now, we've all heard it, maybe around the dinner table, maybe from your mum and dad, maybe even from your grandparents. It's become one of those great Australian property myths. But new research has shown that there's finally some hard numbers around that argument, and the results, well, they may surprise you. The work comes from Terry Ryansley, the senior economist from KPMG, who has analysed more than 40 years of ABS data. Importantly, he didn't just look at what interest rates were on paper, he has looked at something far more meaningful. How much of a household's income was actually being consumed by mortgage interest repayments, because that's where families really feel it. Back in 1989, when the cash rate peaked at 17.5%, interest repayments consumed around 5.7% of household income. When we fast forward to today, despite the mortgage rates being dramatically lower, Australian households are now spending around 5.4% of their income on interest repayments. Now think about that for a moment. We're almost back at the very same level of financial pain back in the 1980s, close to a 17% interest rate. Why? Because today's mortgages are enormous. Back then, people certainly borrowed far less because property values were obviously far lower, and today a lower interest rate applied to a much bigger loan can hurt just as much. And in many cases, it hurts even a lot more. And here's the part that is really concerning. If the RBA increases the interest rate again in August, that repayment burden will climb to 6% of household income. And if that happens, we'll be in territory Australia has never experienced before. So the next time someone tells you that they survived the 17% interest rate environment, they're not wrong, but they're also not comparing like with like. The real story isn't the interest rate, it's the size of debt Australians are now carrying. And this helps to explain why confidence has fallen and why buyers remain cautious and why so many are feeling financially stretched. Now let's talk about first home buyers, because this is where I really struggle to understand the logic that's coming out of Canberra. The government, as everybody knows, introduced this first home buyer scheme and guarantee, and it was designed to help young Australians get onto the property ladder. Now, eligible buyers only needed to pay a 5% deposit, with Australian taxpayers effectively standing behind the loan through the government guarantee. Then the scheme was expanded again, opening the door to around 50,000 permanent residents. These are non-Australian citizens. So let's think about that and what happened. At a time when housing affordability was already under enormous pressure, the government deliberately increased the buy demand by bringing more people into that very market, with many of them only putting down a 5% deposit. Then almost immediately afterwards, they fundamentally changed the taxation landscape through the federal budget. Now, markets run on confidence, as we know, and when you materially change the investment landscape, markets adjust. And that's exactly what we're now seeing. Confidence, well, it has weakened and eroded. Auction clearance rates, well, they have collapsed and prices are falling, particularly across many of the entry-level markets where first home buyers have now been most active. Fresh reporting this week shows that 9 out of the 10 most popular postcodes under the first home buyer guarantee have already recorded price declines. Now, that should concern all Australians, because these are the very buyers the government was trying to help. Now, with only 5% deposit down, it doesn't take much of a market correction before that equity starts disappearing. Now, some buyers are already now entering negative equity, where they owe more on their mortgage than the property is worth. Now, negative equity isn't automatically a crisis. If you can hold on to the property over the long term, you'll often recover. But life, as we know, doesn't always go to plan. People, well, they lose jobs. Relationships, they break down. Families relocate. And if you're forced to sell while you are in negative equity, that's when the real financial pain begins. So I come back to one simple question. If the objective was to help first home buyers, why encourage thousands of Australians into the market with minimal equity, then expand the scheme to thousands of more buyers who weren't even Australian citizens, and then significantly change the investment landscape only weeks later? Looking at what's happening today, it's a fair question to ask, does that sequence of decisions actually make any sense whatsoever? Now, if you think I'm just a real estate agent whinging and talking about a softer real estate market, think again. The Reserve Bank of Australia is now warning that a weaker housing market has the potential to weigh on consumer spending and ultimately the broader Australian economy. Why? Well, because property isn't just another asset class. It's one of the biggest drivers of confidence in Australia. When people feel wealthier, they spend more. When confidence falls, spending slows. And that's exactly what the Reserve Bank is watching closely. Well, the banks are also watching this closely too. Behind the scenes, lending has slowed dramatically. Macquarie Bank says new investor lending has fallen by as much as 50% compared to this time a year ago, while owner-occupier lending is down around 20%. Westpac and NAB, they're also reporting weaker application volumes. The result? Well, competition, not between the buyers, between the banks. Major lenders are now already starting cutting investment mortgage rates to compete for a shrinking pool of borrowers. That's a significant shift. Banks don't cut rates because business is booming. They cut rates because they want more customers through the door. So where does that leave all of us right now? Well, we've closed the first month of winter. Property prices are under pressure, auction markets remain weak, and borrowers are carrying record levels of debt. Builders, well, they're also struggling to make affordable housing stack up, and banks are fighting harder for fewer borrowers. Now, none of those stories exist in isolation, but together they paint the overall picture of where the Australian property market is sitting right now here today. But here's something that remains the same. Markets don't stop. People still get married, families still grow, children are born, jobs change, people retire, relationships end, and estates need to be settled. Life keeps moving, and property moves because life does. The difference in a market like this is that strategy matters more than ever. For buyers, opportunities are beginning to emerge that simply weren't there even 3 months ago. For sellers, well, the market is still moving, but presentation, pricing, and strategy have never been more important. So don't make decisions based purely on the headlines. Understand what's happening on the streets and also understand the data behind it. Then make your move with real confidence. Now, that's what's going down in and around the property market this week. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Matt Hayson, and I'll catch you all next week.